Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Knox, President of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. Along with my colleague, Rosette Garcia, President of the League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego, I would like to welcome you to this event presented by the two leagues in our county. The San Diego League is generally south of Highway 56 and also includes Poway and Rancho Bernardo. The North County League is north of Highway 56, including the 8 cities in that area. We work jointly on county and regional issues. A few quick announcements. The San Diego League will be having a luncheon on Wednesday, April 24 on gender equity in San Diego and beyond. The deadline to register is coming up on Sunday, so be sure to let us know if you'd like to attend that. We're also hosting a meet and greet for new and prospective members on May 1st from 5 to 7:30 p.m. at a brewery in Bay Park. Our election volunteer meeting will be Monday, May 20th at 6 p.m. and our annual business meeting Thursday, June 13 at 6 p.m. You can register for events on our website, lwvsandiego.org. The League of North County San Diego, their next general member meeting is scheduled for May 3 from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. We especially invite new members to come and be welcomed into League. And also we'll hear from the Observer Corps and get a preview of the annual meeting. The annual meeting is scheduled for June 8 at 11 a.m. You can register for those events at lwvncsd.org, and those links are in the chat for you. While our events are open to the public, we encourage you to become a member. The cost includes membership in the US and California leagues as well. Find out more on either league's website. Many volunteers have worked to make this possible, and we greatly appreciate the donations that were made during registration. For anyone who would like to donate today, we will put links in the chat. And now on to our topic of the evening. Money in politics, also known as campaign finance regulation, has been an active issue for the League of Women Voters nationally since 1973. Since this is an election year, having a webinar to discuss this issue is important. I will briefly review the League work on this nationally and some of the current topics of advocacy. The League has a detailed position on money in politics, which can be found in the document Impact on Issues, which is on the National League website. In brief, the League supports public financing of elections with reasonable spending limits by candidates, enhanced enforcement of campaign finance laws, abolishing super PACs, and restrictions on direct donations and bundling by lobbyists. The National League is currently focused on advocacy in support of greater disclosure of bundled donors. It has also participated in litigation supporting disclosure requirements for online political advertising. We put a Money in Politics resource list on the websites of both of our leagues, which contain current sources of public information, nonprofit groups that are tracking money in politics, and league resources on this. Those links will be in the chat. Now, I would like to turn this over to Rosette Garcia, President of the North County League, to introduce our two speakers.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you again for joining us this evening. And I'd also like to thank our two speakers, Brian Adams and Edward Burke, for agreeing to spend time with us this evening to talk about this important topic. We were so pleased when they agreed, when they said yes. So our first speaker this evening is Brian Adams. Brian Adams joined the Political Science Department at San Diego State University in 2003. He has focused his research on local governments, the government closest to the people. Approaching this topic from a few different angles, he examines how well local governments deliver on their promise of representative democracy and what forces or circumstances enhance or undermine democratic processes at the local level, including elections. His book, Campaign Finance in Local Elections, Buying the Grassroots, explored how the campaign finance system affects the democratic character of American elections. Tonight, he will start us off by providing us with a general overview of the laws governing campaign finance, including campaign finance limits and enforcement mechanisms. He'll tell us a little about recent trends, point out some possible solutions, and maybe some more. But before we hear from him, let me introduce you to our second speaker, David Edward Burke. David is an attorney and the founder of Citizens Take Action, a nonprofit that is focused on political reform and increasing civic engagement. He is a leading advocate for a constitutional amendment to get big money out of politics. He's also the author of a report card that grades cities throughout California, including our own region, San Diego County. And I believe that's on the resource list that we've put together. Anyway, looking at, so he's prepared these report cards on that grade cities throughout California on the strength of their campaign finance laws and the transparency of campaign finance data. Prior to founding Citizens Take Action, David worked as a congressional staffer and campaign coordinator. In 2022, David was elected to the Cypress City Council. He'll tell us about the problems that exist with our current system, solutions that have been proposed, what's worked, what hasn't, and discuss other potential reforms. Each will take about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. So as they're speaking and as questions come to you, please put them in the chat, and at the end, we'll open it up to Q&A. But so let's get started. Brian.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for hosting this event. I'm delighted to be here. So to understand how we got to our current situation with campaign finance, you have to go back to Watergate. After Watergate, Congress passed a major campaign finance reform bill. Really still is the gold standard for campaign finance reform. It limited contributions, which is how much money individuals and groups can give to an individual or to a group supporting a candidate. It limited campaign expenditures, how much candidates could spend when they run for office. It limited how much groups could spend on behalf of candidates, what are called independent expenditures. It limited personal funds that candidates could do. It created public financing systems for both president and for Congress. And it also increased disclosure, so everybody would know where the money is being raised from and how it's being spent. Really comprehensive. Then in 1976, the US Supreme Court stepped in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo and struck down large parts of the law. And the Supreme Court basically said that campaign financing was political speech and protected by the First Amendment. When a candidate spends money when they run for office, they're spending money to communicate their political message. They're saying, vote for me for X, Y, and Z reasons. For the court, that's political speech, and that government can't come in and tell people they can't do that. So if a candidate wants to spend money or to raise money to communicate their political messages when they run for office, they have a constitutional right to do so. So the court struck down mandatory expenditure limits, saying the government can't limit how much money a candidate spends on their election. It struck down limits on independent spending. So if a group, a business, a union, political action committee, they want to spend money on a campaign, they can spend unlimited amounts. They have a constitutional right to do so. They struck down limits on candidates using their personal funds on their campaigns. Also struck down any type of mandatory public financing as well. They did allow for contribution limits, so government can limit the amount of money that individuals give to a candidate. They did allow for voluntary public financing, so candidates can choose to do public financing if they want to, and they allowed for disclosure as well. But they struck down most of the really significant reforms that were passed after Watergate. The Citizens United decision in 2010 reaffirmed this logic. So Citizens United, again, equated campaign spending with free speech, and so that government cannot limit. In fact, they expanded in some ways the logic in Buckley to expand even further. So it leaves us in a situation today where some of the most obvious ways to reform campaign finance are not constitutional. Government cannot limit the amount of money that candidates spend. Government cannot limit how much a business or a union or a political action committee wants to spend on politics. And what is left generally isn't as effective, which I'll talk about in a second. But before I get there, let me just talk a little bit about some trends in local campaign finance. So over the past 20 years, there have been two major trends in how money is raised and spent in local elections. I'm talking generally throughout the country, but they also apply to here in San Diego as well. The first is parties have gotten a lot more involved in campaign finance. So I did the book that Rosette mentioned, Campaign Finance in Local Elections. I started that book around 2005 or so. And at that time, almost all money in local elections was raised and spent by the candidates themselves. So a candidate would go out, raise a bunch of money from donors, and spend it. Parties were involved. They've always been involved in local elections, despite being formally nonpartisan. But they were involved in a relatively minor way. That's changed. Nowadays, parties are much more heavily involved in campaign financing. Parties do a lot more to help candidates raise money. They'll share donor lists. They'll funnel money into candidates. So even though the money looks like it's going to the candidates, it's really coming through the parties. And parties will actually actively work to help certain candidates raise money that the party is endorsing. So parties have gotten much more involved in local elections, both with campaign financing and other ways over the past 20 years. Another big change is there's been an increase in independent expenditures, right? So this is money that is spent or that is raised and spent by groups independent of the candidate, unions, business groups, political action committees, and so forth. Again, they've always been involved. They've always been spent money on behalf of candidates. They do so more now. And there's a greater portion of campaign spending that is coming from these independent groups. The upshot of all of this is that we've moved from a system where almost all the money was being raised and spent by candidates to a system where now money is coming from multiple different sources, from candidates, from independent groups, and from political parties. That has made the prospect of regulating campaign finance significantly more difficult. It used to be 20 years ago, if you could regulate candidates, if you can put limits on what candidates are doing or provide public financing to candidates, that could be pretty effective, or at least had a potential to be effective. Today, it wouldn't be enough because you've got all this other spending and raising of funds that are going on. So we have a number of reforms that the Supreme Court does allow. Most of the research that's been done by political scientists on these reforms have generally found they're not particularly effective. So starting with contribution limits, right? So this is a limit on how much an individual or a group can give to a candidate or a political party. It's fairly easy to get around those with independent expenditures. So if you're a group and you want to give $100,000 to Todd Gloria, well, you can't do it directly, right? There's a limit on that, but you can spend it on behalf of Todd Gloria yourself. So it's a pretty easy way to get around contribution limits. There are other ways in which donors or find ways in which to contribute large sums of money despite having contribution limits. Most of the research has shown that contribution limits don't lower the overall amount of money being spent in elections. That said, it doesn't mean they're a bad idea. Now, David's going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why they're a good idea. Some critics of contribution limits say that, they help incumbents, they help extremist candidates. There's actually no evidence to support that. I think most of the research shows that contributions have a fairly minimal impact on outcomes, maybe a slight positive impact. There has been some research to show that maybe there's a little bit of benefit to contribution limits here and there, depending on the context. But they're certainly not a silver bullet, and they're certainly not a solution to some of the larger problems that we see in the campaign finance system. Then we have public financing. And the most common form of public financing that people propose today are what are called clean elections. This is when candidates voluntarily agree to limit their private fundraising and their spending of private funds in exchange for getting public money. Typically, how this works is a candidate will collect a small number of donations from individuals, usually like $10 or $20 contributions from a few hundred people that live in their district, just to demonstrate they're a legitimate candidate. And once they do that and demonstrate they're legitimate, they qualify for public funding, and they'll get a lump sum of money, of public money from the government. And in exchange for getting that money, they will agree to not raise any more private money or to limit their private fundraising and agree to some sort of general expenditure limit as well. This makes a lot of sense, and it's been tried in a number of different cities and states as well. There are some challenges, though, to clean elections that have emerged. One is that it's voluntary. So if you're a candidate and you can raise a lot of money on your own, you're simply going to not run clean. You're going to run, quote, dirty, because you can raise all the money you want, and there can be no limit for what you can raise, and why limit yourself in that way? So it doesn't really work to limit how much money sort of the big players actually raise and spend, because they simply don't participate in the program. And these candidates often, the candidates who decline clean money and don't accept public money, they often significantly outspend the candidates that do accept public money. So often the public grants aren't nearly enough to match what the candidates that are raising private money can actually raise. That provides a real disincentive for candidates to run clean, right? So if you're thinking about, well, do I want to accept public money and give myself that expenditure limit, or do I want to deny it and allow myself to raise more money? Well, if you know your opponent is going to raise 3 times the amount of the public grant, you may think twice about running clean, right? So that's been a big challenge with these clean money regimes. But there's another problem too, in that if you decide to run clean, you limit yourself as a candidate to how much money you're going to raise and spend. But your supporters can raise and spend as much money as they want independently of you, right? And this has actually been a real problem in places like Arizona that has clean elections, is where a candidate will say, okay, I'm going to run clean. I'm going to limit my expenditures. I'm not going to raise private money. And then their supporters create a political action committee and raise all that money independent of the candidate and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars raised from interest groups to support that candidate. That effectively makes the clean candidates effectively dirty. But there's nothing the government can do about it, right? I mean, because the candidate can't limit their supporters from raising and spending money, and the government can't hold those supporters to any agreement the candidate actually has. So that's been a big challenge as well. So the research on clean elections has been mixed. There has been some research to show that it has had some positive impact, especially when it first gets implemented. What's often happened with clean money regimes is that the first election it's tried, it actually works really well. There's like this novelty effect. Everybody's really excited about it. A lot of candidates decide to run who ordinarily wouldn't run. And then after a few election cycles, the traditional power players in politics figure out how to game the system. They figure out how to work around it, and it ends up really undermining the effects of the clean election system. So Arizona is a really good case of this. The first election it was tried, it actually worked really well. And then since then, well, Arizona's gone back to like being Arizona. And we haven't really seen the big improvement. And again, that's not to say that clean elections is a bad idea. I've never seen any research that actually show that it does any harm. I mean, there's very little legitimate research that actually shows that public financing, favors certain types of candidates over others or undermines, public goals or anything like that. So it's not that it's bad. It's just that the impact has been fairly minimal and certainly hasn't met, I think, a lot of reformers' goals in terms of trying to have substantive reform of the campaign finance system. Then we have democracy vouchers, which is the latest in campaign finance reform. Basic democracy vouchers is when individual voters will be given vouchers that they can then give to candidates that they support. So Seattle is the first city that has tried this. I think they tried it first in 2017 was the first election it was tried. Each registered voter in Seattle gets $100 in vouchers, and they can give it to any participating candidate that they like. And for candidates to receive the vouchers, they've got to agree to voluntary expenditure limits. They've got to agree to limit some of their private fundraising. There's some other limits as well, right? So like with clean elections, the whole point of like democracy vouchers is to get candidates to voluntarily limit their private fundraising and their spending of private funds. The jury is still out on democracy vouchers. So Seattle's initial experiment, it worked okay, except a lot of voters didn't actually use their vouchers, which is a little bit disappointing. I mean, you're giving people free money. Like, do whatever you want with this $100, give it to any candidate you want. And large numbers of voters didn't give it to anybody, right? And of course, there were biases in who were more likely to use them than not. So generally wealthier, more politically engaged voters were more likely to use their democracy vouchers than lower income voters who were less politically engaged. So there was that bias there. As it's been established, we have seen a little bit of an increase in the use of democracy vouchers over the last couple of elections in Seattle. So that's been a positive sign. But it's still the case that the majority of voters actually don't use their vouchers. So that's been a concern with democracy vouchers. Another concern has been, and I haven't seen that much evidence of this in Seattle so far, but it's a concern that I have if it were implemented in a place like San Diego, which is that candidates can try to manipulate voters to get their vouchers. Candidates will find ways, if money's on offer, they will find ways to try to extract that money from voters and get it for themselves, right? They will find ways to try to convince voters to sell voters and give your vouchers to me. So I can easily think of a lot of underhanded ways that candidates can try to manipulate voters. And from a voter's perspective, I mean, you can't use the money for anything else. May not even think a lot about it. And you may just sort of give it to a candidate that happens to, post something on social media you happen to like, and give away your democracy vouchers to candidates that you may, if you knew more, may not actually support. I haven't seen any evidence of that yet in Seattle, or I think there's one or two other cities that have tried democracy vouchers. But I would be concerned that candidates will find ways to manipulate the system. But also with democracy vouchers, it runs into some of the same problems as clean elections, and that the candidates that can raise a ton of money are simply going to decline democracy vouchers. So a lot of candidates in Seattle that are well-funded, supported by interest groups, will simply not accept democracy vouchers and spend and raise all the money they want and significantly outspend their opponents. And of course, even the candidates that accept democracy vouchers can still benefit from independent expenditures on their behalf from interest groups and others who want to spend on their campaign. So I think democracy vouchers are worth trying. It's a really neat experiment, and I think there's a lot of benefit that could potentially come from giving voters that option. I do think democracy vouchers could potentially work better than clean elections, just because you're empowering voters, I think, a lot more and really expanding the voter base. I'm a little bit skeptical, though. I mean, Seattle in some ways is the best case scenario. Seattle has a long history of political engagement in local elections. Their elections are actually less expensive, less money is spent than in a lot of other large cities. So if it's going to work anywhere, it'll work in Seattle. And even if it works in Seattle, it may not work as well in a place like San Diego, which does not have that tradition. Okay, so what should we do? I've just talked about all the things that don't work. What could work? Well, I don't have a grand solution here, but let me just offer a couple of different thoughts. My first suggestion is to give up on the idea of trying to limit the overall amount of money in politics. I know that's the gold standard, and that would be great. I just don't think it's feasible. Even if we can get rid of the logic that was established in Buckley through the constitutional amendment that David's going to talk about, I'm not even sure it's possible to limit the overall amount of money in politics. I mean, there's too much at stake. There's too many incentives for people to spend a ton of money on politics that I just think in some ways it's a fool's errand to try to do that. And even if we could, I'm not even sure what a fair way to do that would be. Like how you decide how much each candidate should be able to spend. I'm not sure if there's a fair way to decide, well, this group can spend this amount of money and that group can spend that amount of money. It's a really tricky thing when you start talking about saying you can only spend this much money, running political ads or engaging in messaging. So I'm not so sure that's really what we should be focusing on. But if we take it as given that there's not much we can do about limiting spending, what can we do? Well, I do like the idea of increasing transparency and disclosure. And I know David's going to talk a lot about that, so I'm going to gloss over that at the moment and just say that I fully endorse a lot of the things that David's group is trying to do to improve disclosure, just so at least we know what money is being raised and how money is being spent. I think that is very valuable. So I think that's a really important part going forward. And we are able to do that. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do there. But the other thing, well, two other things I'd also point out, and this may seem like a really odd suggestion in the campaign finance discussion, but I actually think ranked choice voting could actually help reduce the overall amount of money in local politics. And that may seem weird, but think about it for a minute. So ranked choice voting is where instead of having a primary election that narrows down the field and then having a general election with the top two candidates running, you simply have one election where everybody ranks their choices, all the voters rank their choices for office, and then you simply choose based on a formula of how candidates get ranked. What that means is instead of candidates running in two elections, a primary and general, they simply run in one election. Well, if you're only running in one election, you have less money you need to spend. The election season will be shorter. You can actually shorten the fundraising window, which I know David's going to talk about in a minute as well. And actually, I haven't seen any really good research on this, but preliminarily, I actually have seen some evidence that going to ranked choice voting could potentially reduce the amount of money that candidates actually spend in local elections. That could be essentially one way to go about it. But the last point I want to make, and I think the most important point I would suggest, is that the biggest problem with campaign financing is that candidates need to spend money to get their message out, right? The reason why candidates raise tons of money is because they have to, because voters aren't paying attention. And the only way to communicate your message to voters is to pay for advertising, right? In a local context, that means sending out direct mail, and we all get them, right? Running online ads, or if you're running for mayor, maybe TV ads or whatever. That's what most campaign spending is on. It's on advertising. And advertising is necessary because if you don't advertise, voters won't even know who you are because voters don't pay attention to local politics. If voters did pay more attention, if voters actually really paid attention to local elections, campaign spending would matter less. And it wouldn't matter as much how much money candidates had to pay for advertising. That voters can make their own decisions about who they want to vote for. And they would potentially support candidates that actually aren't supported by big donors and don't have lots of money to spend and so forth. So I don't want to let voters off the hook here. Often we present campaign finance as being this problem with the evil special interest groups corrupting our political system. And that's true. There are evil interest groups corrupting our political system. But voters share some of the blame here as well, because it's their apathy and their lack of attention to politics that makes campaign spending that much more important. So how do we get voters to pay more attention? Well, I have no idea. So I'm not going to pretend I have a grand solution to that, but I will leave you with this thought. I actually think it is easier and more feasible to actually change voter behavior than to change campaign finance patterns. It would actually be easier to get voters to pay more attention to what's going on in local politics than to try to get interest groups and other major donors to candidates to stop giving as much money to those candidates. So I actually think the best way to try to address money in politics is try to address the voter side and try to change elections so that we're getting more attention by voters. And that could have some very positive impacts in reducing the influence of money. And I'll stop there and thank you.
All right, Brian, that was so thought-provoking. I just want to extend this and have a 3-hour conversation about every aspect of what you talked about. So that was fantastic. I was taking notes. All right, well, now I've got to get into presenter mode. So thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm a big fan of the League's work. Thrilled that you're considering this topic so thoroughly. I want to tell you a little bit about my background before I jump into the presentation. I was a son of a high school government teacher. My dad was a high school government teacher, so I've always been interested in politics and government. And after college, I went to work in Congress for the Ways and Means Committee. And it's there that I really had an awakening about the role of big money in politics. I saw how much time elected officials spent fundraising. I saw how lobbyists had so much more access to members of Congress and staffers than your average constituent did. And then over time, it was very easy to see on issues like prescription drug prices or common sense gun reforms that groups that were spending heavily on lobbying were getting what they wanted, even if it wasn't what the vast majority of Americans wanted. And so I was already very skeptical about the role of money in politics. Then I went to law school. I read about some of the cases that Brian mentioned, and I thought, boy, these cases seem poorly reasoned, and they make it far too easy for ultra wealthy individuals and corporations and unions to exert undue influence over our system. And so that's why I got into this. I came to view big money in politics as such an important systemic problem. And so I started Citizens Take Action for a constitutional amendment to help undo the damage caused by the Supreme Court decisions that Brian talked about. It would shift power back from the Supreme Court to legislators and voters to take control of our campaign finance laws. It would allow us to overturn Citizens United or eliminate super PACs and pave the way for more publicly financed elections and additional reforms. And so while that remains a top priority long-term goal and the biggest piece of the puzzle, we also wanted to focus on state and local reforms and what we could do at the local level. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight specifically, is what can we do at the local level to work within the constraints we have. And so as Brian explained in his overview, the Supreme Court has us fighting this battle essentially with one hand tied behind our back. And despite the legal framework we have, there are still so many problems with our current campaign finance system. The first problem is that the reality and appearance of pay-to-play politics still exists and is very much alive and well. Studies show that large campaign contributors typically gain more access to elected officials and that legislation tends to go in their favor over time. At the federal level, it's pharmaceutical companies and big tech spending the most money nowadays. But at the local level, it's more commonly real estate developers, labor unions, waste management companies spending a lot of money. For example, I noticed in the city of San Diego, a PAC called Community Voices that was funded primarily by building and real estate groups, spent over $77,000 in independent expenditures in just one district election. In the city of Vista, the firefighters PAC spent over $59,000 in independent expenditures in 2 election cycles. And that was actually more than some of the winning candidates themselves spent in their own campaign contributions. A second challenge, oh, it's misnumbered. Second challenge is excessive influence from outside the jurisdiction. What I mean by that is it's possible for local campaigns to be funded almost entirely by people or businesses that don't reside in the city. And I've noticed looking at local campaign finance reports, it's common to see candidates who have 80 or 90% of all their contributions that don't come from residents. And that understandably troubles voters who would prefer that campaigns are funded by the people who are ultimately being represented. I think this system also leads to a smaller viable candidate pool. Typically, things are skewed in favor of wealthier individuals who can self-fund their own campaigns or who have connections to special interests. It makes it particularly difficult for younger candidates or minority candidates to succeed. And all these things in turn, they decrease public trust in government and they discourage public participation. When when people feel like their local government is beholden to special interests and they don't have much influence, they get turned off from the process altogether. So the question is, how can we work within the current legal constraints to make an impact? And as Brian said, we're very limited here. My concise answer, and I'll add on to some of what Brian said later, to what we can do is sort of a combination of three things, right? First, we can try and enact stronger campaign contribution limits and limit the amount of money that an individual or entity can contribute directly to someone's campaign. At the local level, I think this is probably more impactful of a reform, especially in smaller cities, than it might be at a higher level. Because at the local level, you often have races where a candidate can succeed while only spending $20,000, $30,000. And so if there's a very high contribution limit, their campaign could be funded by only 2 or 3 people. Lower campaign contribution limits, I think, can serve to create a more diverse group of contributors and prevent maybe 1 or 2 special interests from dominating in that area. The second thing I'll mention is, right, because we can't limit independent expenditures, we have to figure out what to do about those. Enhanced disclosure and publicity of independent expenditures are the best thing we can do in that area. And I use the word publicity very intentionally, right? Anything we can do to help voters understand whose money has influenced their elections is good. Requiring better disclosure is part of it. But another part of it is journalism. It's spreading the word. It's letting people know, hey, there's this mysterious PAC flooding your mailbox with this mailer supporting a candidate. The more we spread the word about independent expenditures and let people know what's going on, I think the less impact they have. And the third piece of the puzzle, which Brian touched on, is publicly financed elections. And he described the different types of systems there, and there are many states and cities that have them to a degree. I think publicly financed elections are the gold standard of what we can really do. If you're talking about diminishing the influence of special interests, improving public trust, and giving hardworking candidates who are willing to raise money from a lot of different donors and knock on doors a better chance to succeed than they have in the current system, I think publicly financed elections are the best way to do it. And as Brian made a good point, you need to make these publicly financed election systems appealing enough that the candidates have an incentive to choose the clean money over the dirty money, so to speak. If you're not awarding enough money through matching funds or a lump sum, then candidates aren't going to choose it. So the system has to be strong enough that it makes rational sense for candidates to choose public funding over going the private route. And ideally, I believe these 3 different types of things can work together in concert to create a stronger system, right? If you have lower contribution limits, if you have much better disclosure and publicity of independent expenditures, and you have publicly financed elections, ultimately what you should have is individual donors having more influence. And as a consequence of that, special interests should have less influence. You also, especially with publicly financed elections, should have more engaged voters, because the more people are contributing to a campaign, the more they're learning about the candidates and getting involved, the more that candidates have to go out and get small dollar donations or signatures to qualify for public funding, the more they have to actually interact with residents instead of just sitting back and letting someone send out mailers for them. So I think that short of passing a constitutional amendment or the Supreme Court changing its mind, this is sort of the best we can do in terms of campaign finance law to work with the system that we have. And so considering those criteria, our organization created a report card that grades cities on the strength of their campaign finance laws and the transparency of campaign finance data. And so I'm going to walk you through the report card. Our goal was to assess where cities stand and offer recommendations for reforms. So I'm going to go over what our standard recommendations were, the overall findings, and then examples from high-scoring cities that we thought did things well. So we've done Orange County and San Diego County. We're working on Riverside County and Alameda County currently. Let's jump in with campaign finance and take a look at the local level. So our recommendation here was a campaign contribution limit of $1,000 or less on individuals and $2,000 or less on PACs. Contrast that with the default limit for cities set by the state of California is $5,500. So we're advocating for a limit that's closer to 20% of what the default limit set by the state is for a city that doesn't pass their own ordinance. In terms of overall findings, 13 of 18 cities, when we published our report card in San Diego, have enacted their own campaign contribution limits, and the average limit was $535. That compared favorably to Orange County, where less than half of cities had enacted their own limit, and the average limit was over $1,000. So the majority of cities in San Diego have done this. The cities you see listed there all have limits under $500, and I believe Imperial Beach just passed a limit of $250 a month or two ago. And so San Diego County cities did better than average in this area. The next criterion we considered was whether there was a limit or prohibition on contributions specifically by contractors or developers. And that targets the parties that are directly doing business with the city. Our recommendation was a limit of $500 or less within 6 months before or during consideration or after consideration of the item. Now, interestingly, a new law, SB 1439, was passed at the state level that affects each city. And that went into effect in 2023 and enacted a similar restriction. It includes prohibition on contributions of over $250, along with reporting and recusal requirements, while a license, permit, or other entitlement is pending before the agency, like your local city council. And so the recommendation we had in our report card is in effect in place in every city by default now. SB 1439 does have some loopholes, and so we recommend a limit or prohibition without those loopholes that exist. But overall, that was an interesting step, in our opinion, in the right direction here. Overall, in San Diego, 3 cities had passed their own unique limits or prohibition on contributions from contractors or developers. In, let's see, Coronado and National City, they both prohibit contributions from the start of negotiation to the completion of performance or the termination of negotiations. One other thing I'll note is this reform is a little bit redundant in cities that already have a low campaign contribution limit, but it's more important in our view in cities that don't have their own low campaign contribution limit. The last criteria we looked at for the campaign finance side was a fundraising window. And our recommendation was a window of 1 year or less prior to the next election during which candidates can raise money. That can help avoid very timely or untimely, depending on how you look at it, contributions where a party has a development project or a contract they're seeking from the city coming up, and then they make large campaign contributions, a week or a month beforehand. If you have a fundraising window that only limits contributions to the 11 months or year preceding the election, you can help stop that. So one example in San Diego was Chula Vista, which has a limit on a window for 11 months before the next election. But this has only been enacted by very few cities. I think 3 in San Diego and maybe 1 in Orange County. So it's not very commonly used yet. In addition, there were some other reforms we noticed in cities in San Diego. Some cities placed a limit on contributions by political parties. Others placed a limit on loans from a candidate to their own campaign. And so it was interesting to see cities kind of take a unique approach there. And in addition, publicly financed elections would, of course, qualify as a reform that we graded in our report card, but no cities in San Diego County or Orange County have enacted them yet. If that's something you're interested in working with us on, we would love to help support publicly financed elections in cities in San Diego. But thus far, I believe Berkeley and Oakland are the primary cities in California that have them, and they haven't made their way down here yet. So now let's turn to the second criteria we graded cities on, which was transparency. And what we mean by that is openness regarding the money behind local elections. We want to make sure that residents can easily access the data to show whose money is influencing their local candidates. That helps residents be more informed voters. It helps voters identify when an elected official may be beholden to a special interest. So what we looked at were, first, do cities post the relevant FPPC forms that show campaign contributions and independent expenditures on their city's official website? Second, do cities make those forms easy to find and access and navigate? And third, do cities go back at least 4 election cycles or 8 years, which is typically long enough to cover every contribution and expenditure made in connection with a sitting council member or mayor? So that's what we want to see from cities. Overall, cities in San Diego have posted, most of them have posted at least some of the relevant data, and it's usually not too difficult to find. It's usually somewhere under a city clerk campaign finance disclosure tab or a online transparency tab. But cities didn't do as well in terms of going far back. Only 9 cities went back 4 election cycles, and a lot of cities just go back to the most recent election, so 2022. I want to give you a quick example of what it looks like on a city website when they do a good job at this. The city of Santee, you can see they have a statement that just says campaign statements on their homepage under the city clerk section. From there, you can navigate to their net file system, which is a type of software that cities use to keep track of campaign finance data. You can search by the name of the candidate or committee, or you can click through various election links and look at candidates, ballot measures, independent expenditures, and then ultimately get to the various forms and look at each form for who's spending money to support a candidate or campaign. In another city called Costa Mesa in Orange County, they don't use NetFile, but they have a similar process where they just put the information on their website with a series of links by election cycle, by current council member, by political action committee. And from there, you can navigate and see all of the 497 forms, 460 forms for a given candidate. So that's what you want to see from a city, is either software where you can find every form or a series of links to every contribution and every independent expenditure made in connection with your local elections. Some additional reforms in this area. One was Arizona recently passed a ballot initiative, Prop 211, which requires disclosure of the true names behind independent expenditures supporting printed or digital materials. The idea for this was to require disclosure of who actually earned the money that is paying for the ad and putting that person or business's name on the ad. So it's not just a mysterious PAC or LLC. The city of San Diego also has an additional pre-election candidate filing date so that forms have to be filed and published before election day. So there aren't last minute contributions and expenditures that are made before voters get a chance to see who made them when they cast their ballots. Overall, these are grades for San Diego and Orange County. And the main thing you might notice is that there's a lot of A's and D's and F's and not many B's and C's. And that's because cities have either done nothing on campaign finance, in which case they probably got a D or an F, or they have passed an ordinance that's fairly comprehensive, like what we recommend, which got them an A. You can check out the full report card on our website, or I believe it's through the resource list. Overall, cities in San Diego did pretty well compared to cities in Orange County or cities in Riverside where we're looking, but that doesn't mean there's not significant opportunity for improvement. There are still some F's and D's, and no city, of course, has enacted publicly financed elections or anything of that sort. So if you're interested in getting involved, our report card has a number of actions you can consider. We'd be happy to try and work with anyone who's advocating for reforms in their city. And the last thing I'll say is you can always visit our website and reach out to me directly, david@citizenstakeaction.org, if you want to connect. If you support our work, you can donate through our website at citizenstakeaction.org. We're primarily funded by small individual donors who typically contribute about $20 a month. And that helps us hire part-time staff who assist with research and help us create more report cards and things like that.
Well, thank you very much, Brian and David. You certainly gave us a lot of great information. I learned a lot, and we are ready to start with Q&A. So Kim, do you have a question for either Brian or David, or both of them?
Yes, I think this one will be for David, and it comes from Mary Thompson. She says, tracking San Diego County regional ballot measure contributions and expenditures is very complicated on the Registrar of Voters website. What are your thoughts on improving this transparency? Is this something that the league could get involved with, asking them to change it?
Oh boy, I'll try and answer this concisely if I can. So yes, I would say the state of things is not very good in terms of how easy it is to find information like this. For cities, you can always look on the city website or directly ask the city clerk. For the county, you're sort of subjected to just how good or easy to navigate is your county's website. And if not, it is the kind of thing that perhaps the league could try and advocate for. I want to show you something real quick. I'm going to do another screen share if that's okay. This is what the state, or is it? Okay. This is what it looks like in the state of Washington when you look up campaign finance info for local candidates. They have a searchable database. They break it down with graphs and charts by who contributed, and it's beautiful. I've been talking to some of our state legislators about trying to implement something like this in California. I know our Secretary of State's website is due for revamping, and hopefully they will make improvements that make it easier than it currently is. But for now, we're kind of stuck with the way things look at the county level, and we just have to be persistent and pesky about trying to get the information if it's not easily available.
Thank you.
I have a question. Brian, you talked a lot about, I actually thought you were kind of gloomy about the prospect of getting money out of politics in our country. Are some of the challenges related to this have to do with financing of the enforcement agencies, the FEC or the California Fair Practice Commission? Do they have sufficient resources and ability to enforce? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the ethics commissions in San Diego and elsewhere are chronically underfunded. And often the commissioners are major political players in their own right and have their own interests when they're making decisions. And of course, that's a problem because, city councils and mayors and other local officials, they don't want oversight, right? They don't want a strong ethics commission looking over their shoulder, looking at their campaign finance practices. So, I mean, the FEC on the national level is the worst of the worst. We're better on a local level than I think we are nationally, which isn't saying much, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge. And I think ultimately in California, it's going to have to come down to citizen initiatives forcing cities to actually put teeth into their enforcement to actually pass some of these campaign finance rules. Because, I mean, every now and then elected officials will decide that it's in their interest to have campaign finance reform, as we saw after Watergate, right? I mean, the political context there was that Congress realized that Watergate was a serious problem. They needed to do something. Even if they didn't want to have campaign finance reform, they needed to do it to earn back the trust of the public. And every now and then that happens on a state or local level. But I think a lot of times it's just going to have to come down to citizen initiatives, forcing local governments to actually take action on this, because elected officials just don't have the incentive to take action on their own.
Thank you. Kim, do you have a question?
Yes. And I think this would be another one for David. Jean says that regarding tracking contributions to assembly candidates, he knows how to track the 460 form, but he's wondering how to track the independent donations that the candidate doesn't have to report.
For the assembly candidates, Brian, am I right that is the Secretary of State's website the best source for that, or is there something you think's better?
No, it would be the Secretary of State website. But I think it's a really good question, because there's a fundamental problem here that applies not just to assembly candidates, but for local candidates or any type of election, in that the money that the candidates raise and spend is reported separately from all the independent expenditures on behalf of that candidate, right? So if you want to know how much money is being spent to support, say, Todd Gloria when he's running for mayor, you can easily find out how much Todd Gloria is raising and spending on his behalf. But that money is reported separately than any independent committees that are also raising and spending money on behalf of Todd Gloria. What ends up happening is the media will often only report on what the candidates are doing, or they'll report on the independent expenditures, but report it separately. But as a voter, you want to know the total amount, right? You don't care whether that money is being spent by Todd Gloria or being spent by some other group on behalf of Todd Gloria. You just want to know how much is being spent and who's spending it. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem with the current way that we disclose contributions and expenditures, is that the independent spending is separate from the candidate spending. And it really gets confusing for voters. I can't tell you how many times I've read news reports where they have said, okay, this is how much money is being spent on the election, and they'll just report what the candidates are spending and ignore all the candidate spending. And certainly they almost always ignore the party spending as well. So I think for me, that is one of the biggest things we should try to challenge or try to change, is to have if you want a total amount of money spent on behalf of a candidate, have a total amount that from the candidate, from the party, from independent groups, so that we can have a really good idea. And I think Seattle does do that, or not Seattle, excuse me, state of Washington does that, as David pointed out. They really are the gold standard for disclosure, but we don't do that anywhere in California. And it really is, I think, problematic from a transparency perspective.
David, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Or
No, I agree. You have to piece it together yourself here. You have to look up the 460s for contributions. Then you have to look up the 496s for independent expenditures. And as Brian said, often when you read about it, journalists focus on one, but not the other. And so, yeah, I agree. It'd be great to have a more centralized resource for that than we do.
There's another question from Jeannie, who asks, she makes an interesting point. It's illegal to accept contributions from outside of the United States. Why wouldn't we make it illegal for donations to come from outside the jurisdiction from which a candidate is running?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, David, did you want to tackle this first, or?
You go ahead. Has someone tried this?
Well, so I have an anecdote here. So before I entered graduate school, I actually worked for the City of Los Angeles Ethics Commission. And we proposed something like this. And it had to do with public financing. They have a matching funds program. And we said you can only match funds from donors within your district, which makes sense, right? You're not matching donors from outside your district. The argument we got back was from candidates who are running in low-income districts. They're like, well, we don't have a lot of wealthy people who give us money here. And it actually would really make it hard for us to actually raise sufficient money to actually run our campaign, that we actually need to rely on donors outside of the district. They also argued that, listen, I may be in District 1 running for a council seat in District 1, but people in District 6 care about what I do because I'm making decisions on behalf of the whole city. So why shouldn't they be able to donate to my campaign? So, I mean, I don't buy either of those arguments. I actually think it makes a lot of sense that if you're running in District 1, that you would only get money from District 1. But there's a lot of political opposition to that. And I actually would question whether the courts would uphold it as well. I'm not aware of anybody who's actually tried it. I know the idea has been floated. I do know there are some cities that when they have public financing programs, they do limit public financing, like matching funds to just those within the district. But I think the courts may look askance at that because it really would be a major burden for a lot of candidates if they really could only raise money from within their district. And it really would favor certain types of candidates over others. So I think it's a good reform. But I'm not holding my breath to see it be implemented.
Yeah, I'll agree with Brian. So obviously we both probably have a low level of confidence that the Supreme Court would uphold such a reform, even though we think it's a good idea. But I have seen in some cities, they do use their publicly financed elections that way, where the matching funds are, you have to be a contribution from a resident or from the district. So while I don't think you could limit contributions like that legally, I do think that's a potential benefit of trying to implement publicly financed elections as a way to say, hey, you want your elections funded by local residents? We're going to give matching funds for every contribution from a local resident. So I think that's the best way that it could be achieved in the current environment.
We also had a question about the growing influence of labor unions, particularly law enforcement unions, on local parties. There have been some occasions in primaries where they've been able to control who their favorite candidate would be matched up with in the primary. Any thoughts on that?
No, I would just say I agree with the person who asked the question. It's overwhelming. The amount of influence from some of the local unions in local elections. In the city here in Orange County, Santa Ana, I don't know if people have heard about this, but the local police union essentially just funded a recall against 2 council members who I believe voted against, the pay increase, but the pay increase still passed. So the union got what they wanted, but they still went after the candidates who voted against it. So it's just one of those challenges where there's outsized influence, and short of the enhanced disclosure and publicity so that people know about it, I'm not quite sure what else you can do. But Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a qualification to that. It is true that unions do spend a lot of money, and particularly for like school boards and whatnot, they do dominate. Business does outspend labor about 10-1 in campaign finance. That's nationally. I'm not sure locally specifically. It's probably pretty similar. One of the challenges here is that there are many fewer unions than there are businesses, right? So you have a handful of unions that spend a lot of money, and then you have a larger number of businesses that spend less each, but in the aggregate actually spend more. So it actually gets a little bit tricky when you start thinking about union influence versus business influence. As David mentioned earlier, the biggest influence, you're looking at real estate developers or other types of businesses actually probably spend the most in the aggregate, even though on an individual level, some of the biggest donors are actually unions. So you do have to be a little bit careful when you're thinking about the relative influence of these different groups.
There's a question. Let me see if I can. Here's the question. Is there a way to find out if a candidate's employer received donations from parties that then gets contracts from the government body that person votes in? I'm sorry, was that clear? I guess they're talking about an elected official who's employed by someone, and that employer is making donations to the government body.
Well, you'd find out by looking at the contribution and independent expenditure reports and just trying to see what you could identify there. And then, Brian, maybe you could help me out, but some cities have their own recusal requirements for situations like that, but I'm not sure that all of them do. And so I think it varies from city to city in terms of whether a contribution like that triggers a conflict from which the council member or elected official should recuse themselves, or whether the city has no such policy. And that's kind of another area that you can look at, potential reform is stronger conflict of interest policies for situations like that.
Yeah, so it does vary a lot from city to city. There are state rules that elected officials have to disclose their financial interests, right? So all local officials have to say, what properties they own, what, where their investments are and whatnot. But those conflict of interest rules, they're good ideas. They're really hard to enforce because it's like there's a lot of gray area there. And there have been a lot of cases of where an elected official is like, well, I'm not sure whether this is a conflict of interest or not. And then the city attorney's got to weigh in. And there's often a lot of nuance to sort of, well, is this enough of an interest that the elected official has to sort of cause the conflict or so forth. So I think there's a lot of, I don't think anybody's really come up with a good way to have a very clear and direct rule when this is when elected officials have to recuse themselves, right? This is when, if they receive a contribution from a particular individual as business before the city, they've got to recuse themselves. So that's still a work in progress. And I'm interested to see how it plays out with some of these new rules, like in the city of San Diego. But it is, historically, they've been really hard to enforce.
Can I add something? So I was going to mention this in my presentation, but I got so excited by listening to Brian that I went over. I apologize. Okay, but there's a lot of questions about, like, how do you find the source of this info? Or how do you know when this PAC is spending money? One thing I'll say is that you as individuals watching this can be a valuable source of this information and in spreading the word in your community. It may not be the easiest stuff to find, but I have seen it play out in cities where it just takes one or two dedicated residents to look up who is actually funding a campaign, and then to share that info either by just posting about it in the local Facebook group, writing a letter to the editor of the local paper, tipping off a local reporter. And it has a ripple effect in the community because so many of these things and this money being spent, people just don't know it's happening until it's too late or until after the election. And so if you're looking for something to do in the coming 6 months when we've got an election coming up, if you get a questionable mailer from some mysterious PAC, post about it on Facebook or do some research and try and find out who it's from, or reach out to me or contact your local paper. Because the more you spread the word about this kind of nonsense, the less impact it has. What these groups want is just to put this mysterious mailer in your mailbox and have nobody look at whose name is on it and nobody give a second thought about it. So that's just something I wanted to emphasize, because it can be a really valuable tool where we all as individuals are almost have the power of a journalist here.
Okay, and Brian, I want to go back to you because I think you had a couple responses to David.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a really good point that David made earlier about how campaign finance reform could potentially have a bigger impact in small cities. And I think that actually may very well be true. Most of the research that's been done on campaign finance has been in large cities. Los Angeles and New York have been the two most studied cities when it comes to campaign finance. And most of the other research has been on, Chicago and San Francisco and some other big cities. We actually know very little about what impact campaign finance reform has in a small city. And by small, I mean, anything under 200,000 people. We just don't know. And it may very well be true that something like democracy vouchers may not work great in a big city like San Diego, but may work wonders in a place like El Cajon, right? And maybe in a small city, those types of programs really could fundamentally change the political landscape that maybe wouldn't work in a larger city. So I think that what's really important here is there be experimentation. and that we actually have different cities, particularly small cities, really try a lot of different things to see what works, right? And to try democracy vouchers in different places, or different types of public financing, or conflict of interest rules, or all these other sorts of things, because it really is going to vary depending on the size of the city. It may also vary depending on the political dynamics of the city, right? I mean, big cities are very different than small cities, right? Smaller suburban cities that are mostly residential may have a very different type of campaign finance dynamic than larger cities do. So, I mean, we do know from what research has been done that like the sources of money tend to be fairly similar, but maybe some of these reforms could have a really big impact, a different impact in smaller cities. So there is a lot that we don't know. And I didn't want to give the impression that researchers have figured all this out. We really haven't. I mean, there's been a lot of research on campaign finance, but there are a lot of holes in that research, particularly when it comes to small cities, and particularly when it comes to some of the less common type of campaign finance reforms. And also too, like some nuances in some of these. So David pointed out that, going from no contribution limit to some contribution limit may make a big difference, as opposed to going from like $1,000 contribution limit to $500 contribution limit. And that may be true. There actually hasn't been that much research that's really explored like the nuances of like how low you should go with your contribution limit. Like what's the optimal level that where you get the biggest bang for the buck, right? I probably agree with David that I think that, going from no limit to at least some sort of limit probably does make a difference. Whereas going from a moderate limit to a stricter limit may not make as big of a difference. But we don't know. So I think there's a lot more experimentation that we want to try to see what works and what doesn't.
So I have a quick, maybe just a clarification question, because we've talked a lot about public financing, but so can they ever be made mandatory, or will they always have to be strictly voluntary and the candidates have to volunteer for them?
David, do you want to take that first?
Oh, I believe that under the current law, they have to be voluntary. Mm-hmm. And the only thing that could change that is the Supreme Court changing some prior decisions or passing a constitutional amendment. To the best of my knowledge, is that your understanding, Brian?
Yes, and there is a question here. So all the public financing that we've done have been fairly, I'd say fairly weak, with maybe the exception of New York City, which probably has the strongest public financing system among local governments in the country. They generally, the amounts that candidates have gotten have been fairly low, and there have actually been some pretty decent. There's a lot of options that candidates have for not participating. What hasn't really been tried, if you make a public financing system so generous and so beneficial, at some point does it become a de facto mandatory, right? Suppose, for example, you did a public financing system in San Diego, and you said that all you have to do is collect a few hundred $10 contributions, and we'll give you $1 million to run for mayor, right? Really generous, where almost every candidate will say, of course, I'm going to do that. That's a no-brainer. My guess is that the current Supreme Court would say that's no longer voluntary, that it's actually mandatory because it's too generous, right? So now I don't agree with that logic, but there's that issue about like how generous public financing can be before it becomes effectively mandatory. And I don't know what the answer is to that. But right now, the courts have generally, they definitely have said it has to be voluntary, that you can't force anybody to take public financing. And if you tried, then I think there'd be you'd run up against some real limits if you really try to make it sort of de facto mandatory.
Thank you. Jane Andrews asked, what do you think about the way donations for ballot measures are reported in California? Statewide ballot measures.
When we think about the What about them?
The donations are reported. I couldn't find it on the Secretary of State website. Just
Well, Brian, you probably know more about this than I do in terms of looking up these donations, because I've been focused more on cities. But the one thing I will say is I know that state ballot measures are pose the real challenge of the mysterious entity problem, and that the Disclose Act and the various iterations of the statewide Disclose Act are trying to get at that, to require the disclosure of the 3 top funders. But it feels sometimes to me like, for those sports fans, like steroids in baseball, where the violators were always one step ahead of the people trying to catch them. But Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is actually, I think, a problem with independent expenditures more generally, is that committee names are very difficult to discern. So they have these very generic titles like Californians for Fairness and Honesty, right? And you find out that it's actually a political action committee funded by, electricity companies or whatever, right? I mean, you get a lot of these names that are hide who are really funding them. That it's unclear a lot of where the money is coming from. Now, on the forms themselves, if you actually dig into the forms, you can figure out who's funding, right? I mean, so in California, we do require true names to be used of actual donors, right? So you can figure out, oh yeah, SDG&E is funding this PAC, right? But that requires some digging. And often it's requires a little bit of knowledge about politics and about the political players that oftentimes, or even a lot of reporters, don't actually have. And so, yeah, I agree with David. It's often the donors are one step ahead, and they're finding ways to sort of hide the true source of the funds, and finding ways to make sure the public doesn't actually find out. I mean, and what you really want, what you really want is on the advertising that they're paying for, that on the advertising it actually says who's actually paying for it, right? So when you see an ad for a ballot initiative, you know that that ad is being paid for by a utility company, right? Not Californians for Fairness and Honesty. But that's really hard to do because often these PACs have multiple donors, right? So not always, but sometimes they'll have 10, 20, 30, 50 different companies that are donating to it. So how do you actually do that? And that's I think that's a really tough nut to crack, right? Because it is, I think any regulation you can come up with, I think there'll be easy ways for the donors to find ways around that regulation. And you end up playing this game of whack-a-mole of where you're trying to set up a regulation to limit one practice, and then they come up with some other practice. You have to come up with new regulation for that. And it just becomes very bureaucratic, difficult problem to solve.
Kim, do we have time for one more question? I have a question, if I could.
Sure.
So we're talking about all this money that's being spent, and Brian, you said and David, both of you said the Supreme Court, apparently our Constitution won't allow us to limit money in politics because it's apparently free speech. But putting that aside, I'm just wondering if there are models outside the United States where, there isn't so much money spent. You talked about candidates need to advertise. If there are other models that we might aspire to, that even within the constitutional framework that we're working with.
Well, within the constitutional framework we're working with, I'm not so sure, because the models that you mentioned, I thought of, oh, well, in Canada, they limit the, time period of the election to, I forget what the length of time is, but it's not a never-ending election cycle. And in other countries, it's more robust publicly financed elections and free airtime for candidates, so they don't have to raise the money to pay for the ads. But we are just so limited by our Supreme Court decisions. And that's why I started this by advocating for the constitutional amendment. And I think someone asked in one of the chat questions, if a change in the composition of the Supreme Court could change this. Like, yes, 100%. the 2016 election probably completely changed the face of American campaign finance law, because it means that Donald Trump got to appoint judges instead of Hillary Clinton. And so, yes, that was a huge transformational change in that area. But yeah, within the current framework, I'm not sure what more we can do, because other countries just interpret their constitutions differently. But Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Different European countries do their campaign finance in different ways. So what some of them do is that candidates will, or parties usually will borrow money, public money, at the beginning of the campaign. And then depending on how well they do in the election, some of the money will be forgiven, right? So they'll borrow, say, $100 million at the beginning. The party will borrow that amount. And if they win, that most of that will get forgiven. If they do very poorly, they have to pay most of it back. Which is an interesting sort of dynamic if you think about like the types of strategic choices that candidates and parties can make in that situation. A lot of countries do limit the total amount of money that parties can spend. They do have fundraising windows. Some countries have had new challenges with campaign finance, right? So certainly we're not the only advanced democracy that struggles with this. There are plenty of other countries that have had their own campaign finance scandals and whatnot. But there are a lot of different models out there. But almost all of them have a feature that we cannot have, which is they have a mandatory limit on spending. And the Supreme Court has said no to that. And without that, it really does limit what you can do, right? So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to structure. I will say too that in the United States, there's a lot of different types of campaign finance regimes as well. I mentioned New York City earlier. New York City has a matching funds program where you accept public funding in exchange for limiting your expenditures, and you get, for private donations you raise, you get public matching for that. But they can do as high as a 6-to-1 match, which means like you collect a $50 contribution, you could potentially collect $300 in matching funds from the government, which is very, very generous. Right now, the New York program isn't perfect, but that's a very different type of system than what a lot of other public financing programs around the country do. So there are like infinite varieties of public financing, and they may vary just depending on the political culture as well. I think a lot of the European systems for campaign finance wouldn't really work here just because we have a different political culture. We have a different norms of how candidates run. We have different needs that candidates have for getting their message out, different party systems and everything else. So and of course that varies across local jurisdictions as well. I mean, San Diego is very different than New York, which is very different than Seattle. And what may work in one place may not work in another place. So I think there probably does need to be a lot of variation across jurisdictions on a local level, just because of all the differences that we see in the political culture and the particular political dynamics that we see.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David and Brian. It's been very interesting to learn from you tonight. And thank you to Rosette and Jane for making this all happen. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.